Revelation 12 and the dragon and the woman. Acts 17:11 reminds us to receive the word and the teaching with all readiness of mind, but we are required to search the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. So we don't just take someone's word for it, we always want to check it out against scripture ourselves. As we do here, we'll go ahead and read the chapter straight through and then come back and circle back and break it down. There's an interesting organization note about this. If you read it chronologically, you have the Satan being cast out of heaven like several times. There's actually a different way to look at it, and it's an outline, it's a poetic structure that the Bible authors use frequently, so we'll look at that. The other interesting note here is that the chapter break probably should have occurred after chapter 11, verse 18, because that's where the scene shifted to the heavenly throne, and then this heavenly perspective is continued in chapter 12. So chapter 11 concluded, "Then God's temple was opened, and the Ark of the Covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail," and we looked at that last time. Then chapter 12 begins, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. On his heads 7 diadems or 7 crowns. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he, the dragon, might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, where in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now is the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea. For the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And then the chapter concludes, and he stood on the sand of the sea. And that's a strangely placed verse, and we'll look at that at the end. So in our Western upbringing, we're taught to think chronologically. So from a very young age, we did timelines. You may remember those from elementary school, where you have, something very, very old happens on the left, and then certain events happen as time progresses. You move towards the right, and we get to modern age. And so if you read Revelation and indeed a lot of the Bible from that perspective, you see like the same things happening over and over again. So in this chapter, we had Satan cast out of heaven a couple of times. We had the woman fleeing into the wilderness a couple of times, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not necessarily the way that the Hebrew authors looked at it. they invoked a number of different literary tools. One of them is appears to be in place here, and it's called, it goes by a couple of different names, but it's an inverted parallel structure, or the technical name for that is a chiasm. So you have a story lined out such that there's an A section, a B section, and a C section, and then there could be any number of sections, but then there'll be some middle section which is a pivot point, and then you'll go back and you'll revisit in reverse order. So the C section, B section, and A section, and then that concludes the passage. So this can span, this can be within a single chapter, or it can span a number of different chapters. It just depends on the structure here. So in this chapter, we see that verses 3 and 4 tend to match with verses 15, 16, and 17. And so we call the first section A, and we call its parallel section A prime. And so, for example, we see the dragon stood ready to devour her child in verse 4. And that seems to parallel verse 17. The dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war, not with the child, but now with the remnant of her seed. And so we see that kind of parallel structure there. We have the woman and her child in the A section, and then the woman and the remnant of her seed in the B section. The A prime section. In the B section, we have verses 5 and 6 that tend to align with verse 14. And so we have this kind of dual mention of the woman fleeing into the wilderness. And so we see that in both verse 6 and verse 14, into her place where she is nourished for a time, and then verse 6 says into a place prepared by God. And then we have this reference to this time period. Verse 6 says 1,260 days, or 1,280 days. And then verse 14 says time, times, and a half a time, and that means 1 year, 2 more years, and then a half a year, which is 3.5 years, which is the same as saying 1,280 days. So we have this kind of parallel structure happening here. And then the C section would be verses 7 through 9, and then that matches with verse 12 and 13. And so this is where we see the great dragon cast out of heaven, and then he is cast down to the earth. And so we see this kind of parallel phrase happening again. And so verse 10 and 11 would be the D section, and that's the interlude where we have rejoicing in heaven. So one way to think about it is you have a train going along 3 different stations, and then eventually they hit the A station, B station, C station. Then this D section is where the train turns around and then goes back in reverse order: C station, B station, and A station. So however we want to look at it, it's just this parallel structure happening here, and that's called a chiasm. We'll find, and we are finding as we go through this book, that things that have their beginning in Genesis have their resolution or fulfillment in Revelation. And part of that is this declaration of war that God made after the serpent tempted Adam and Eve to fall. He says in Genesis 3:15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So, we have this declaration of war that has really been going on for the last 6,000 years, depending on when we think Genesis, the Garden of Eden happened. It's interesting that in verse 15 there, the word for offspring in Hebrew is literally seed. And if I can be a little bit graphic, it's related to the word semen. And so we have a biological contradiction here, right? Because we have the seed of the woman. Well, the seed in biology is in the man. It's not in the woman. So Chuck Missler, because of this, sees a hint of the virgin birth way back in Genesis 3. It won't be a man's seed that is in view here. It'll be the seed of the woman. And we see this playing through in Revelation 12. We're going to have the woman and her offspring, and we read that chapter, and we'll unpack it a little bit more as we move on. So we have some complex visions and just kind of odd things going on here. We have to remember that in verse 19 of chapter 1, John was told, "Write the things you have seen, those that are and those that will take place after this." So he wasn't told to interpret. He wasn't told to rewrite things as he saw them. He wasn't told to rework things that would make sense to him. He was basically acting like a court reporter. whatever he sees, he writes down. And so it's fair to say that he probably didn't understand a lot of this either. And it will be revealed to him as well as to us later on. So we can tell from certain things that happen that John is really almost as clueless as we are with what's going on here. And so what we're seeing here is a glimpse into the supernatural world. And so it's difficult for us because we don't live in that world. We live in the natural world. But at the same time, God commands us to read and understand this book to the best of our abilities, and he promises us a blessing for doing so. So as we mentioned before, the chapter should have really begun with verse 19 of chapter 11. So we are still in heaven. We have the Ark of Covenant being visible, being open to us, and we have the thunder and all of that. And then we should continue. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And to me, this is a direct reference to Genesis 37, where Joseph was explaining his dreams that he had to his family, and didn't exactly go over very well, because then he dreamed another dream. This is verse 9 of Genesis 37, and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream, and behold, the sun, moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And so this is clearly a reference in Revelation 12 to this vision of Joseph. And you might say, wait, I only see 11 stars in Genesis 37 and 12 stars in Revelation 12. Well, that's because Joseph himself is the 12th star. And so if we add Joseph in there, we get a very nice sun, moon, and 12 stars. And that is, to me, it's pretty obvious. It's a picture of Israel. So Keener writes, ancient readers familiar with the Bible would especially recognize here the story of Israel giving birth to Jesus and then Satan's opposition to God's people. So remember that our time, the time dimension is something that we experience on earth, but it's not necessarily true that, heaven is bound by that same dimension. In fact, Einstein proved that time is actually a physical property. You have to have mass, acceleration, and gravity, and absent one or more of those, then you can't have, anything known as time. So it's possible here we are looking, we have a retelling of past events here, and kind of this blur of, what from our perspective is historical versus what is still yet future, where, God in the heavenly realm is, sees it all as one continuous, painting or panorama, if you will. So we have to keep that in mind, that, this is not necessarily, this vision is not necessarily in the future. It could be, the sign of Revelation 12 and then Joseph's vision here, they really could be one and the same. So, but the bottom line is, where it's obvious, we need to let Scripture define Scripture. And I think there's an obvious parallel here with the sun, moon, and the stars, connecting us back to the book of Genesis. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains at the agony of giving birth. And so we see a possible parallel here in Isaiah 66. Before she was in labor, she gave birth. Before her pain came upon her, she delivered a son. Who has heard such a thing? Shall a land be born in one day? And this was in May 14th in 1948. People reference this passage as, yes, the nation Israel was born in a day, although not born of God, but born of the UN and end of World War II and that kind of thing. But they do see, at least a connection to Isaiah 66. The Dead Sea Scrolls, interestingly enough, also speak of the righteous remnant of Israel travailing to give birth to either saved Israel or to the Messiah. And then, we would see probably both are true, because the Messiah is supposed to be the salvation of Israel. Yeshua is Jesus' name in Hebrew, and that actually means salvation. So he's the promised Messiah of Israel. Other commentators speculate that the woman is actually the church, but we've got a couple of issues with that. The church did not give birth to the Messiah. It was, the other way around. And we also have a type problem, because the church is supposed to be the virgin bride of Christ, but here we got a problem because the woman's pregnant. So a little issues there. The Catholic Church, I believe, would see this as Mary, and that's fair, because Mary was the literal immediate mother of the Messiah. But this vision here, and especially tying it back to the sun, moon, and the stars, seems to go far beyond the life of Mary, and more clearly resembles the travails of the nation Israel through the ages. Mary, remember, was Jewish, and so fair to say the mother of the Messiah literally was Mary, but typologically it was the nation Israel, in all of her ups and downs. And the nation is often portrayed as the bride of Adonai. In fact, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai is very similar to a Jewish wedding celebration, where you have a contract and you have a canopy, and all that. So it's very much seen as God Adonai is extending a contract to his bride, the nation of Israel. Here is the second of four women that are featured predominantly in the book of Revelation. So we had Jezebel in chapter 2, and then in chapter 17 we're going to have the harlot who rides the beast. And then finally in Revelation 19, we're going to have the bride at the marriage supper. So it's kind of neat there. Some scholars actually refuse to see this woman Israel, and I mentioned this because a couple of different commentators that I read picked up on this and kind of went down this path. There's a bad doctrine out there called replacement theology, and so I've mentioned it before, but this is the view that when Israel rejected Jesus, she also forfeited the promises that God gave to her. And so the promises then transferred to the church, and so the church becomes spiritual Israel. And so a big problem with this is that most of those promises given to the nation were unconditional. All right, if someone is giving something to you unconditionally, there's nothing you can do to violate the terms. And so we have that. Romans 9, 10, and 11 state very clearly that God is not forsaken Israel. And so we take all this together. Jesus was prophesied to, he will take David's throne, and that was a promise given to Mary in Luke 1. So we have all of this, very much a Jewish context, and we always need to keep that in mind. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns on his heads, 7 diadems or 7 crowns. So a lot of commentators will jump immediately to Daniel 7, which is fair, and they will look at the 4th beast, because the 4th beast is also described as having 10 horns. And there's the belief is that is the Roman Empire. So Daniel saw a vision of 4 beasts, and we interpret these as 4 successive world empires, domination, man-driven, Satan behind them kind of empires. So the only problem here is that the beast in Daniel 7 has only 1 head. It does have 10 horns, so that's fair. When we look at the 4 beasts together, though, we see something interesting. The lion in Daniel 7 or verse 4, which we presume is Babylon, has 1 head and 0 horns. The bear in verse 5, which is Medio-Persia, has 1 head and 0 horns. Now, the leopard, which represents the Greek Empire splitting off into Alexander the Great's 4 generals, and that we see that in verse 6, that is described as having 4 heads and 0 horns. And then the 4th beast has 1 head and 10 horns. So if you add all those together, you get 7 heads and 10 horns, just like we see in Revelation 12. So it's interesting that it's popular to view the beast as the revived Roman Empire. We are reminded that Satan is behind all of man's systems and governments and empires. So from Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, to these 4 empires back in the ancient world, and even to the countries of today, and yes, including America. I mean, I think we can all see that there is an enemy, spiritual enemy of this country working behind the scenes to wreak havoc and all that. So basically all of that, not just the Roman Empire, but all of those empires will one day be defeated. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. And so we started with the declaration of war in Genesis 3:15, because from the very beginning, the enemy began his attacks on humanity and ultimately the Messianic line. So really from that point, after he got, Adam and Eve tripped up, immediately we saw the murder of Abel. Because God in Genesis 3:15 promised, a seed of the woman, and so the attacks on that seed began. The catalyst for the flood was really Satan's attempt to corrupt the human DNA, and we can read about that in Genesis 6. So God had to, fix everything, and there's one survivor, Noah, right? Noah and his sons were pure blood, and then we had to start over again. Once it became known, we have the 12 tribes, so once it became known that the Messiah would come from the line of Judah, then the attacks became focused on Judah's line personally, right? We can read about that in Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, where God, Satan tried to, stop Judah from having any offspring, and it's very clear it was supernatural. Then we get to the Exodus, and Pharaoh tried to wipe out the Hebrews a couple of times, right? Exodus 1 and Exodus 14, where he pursued them even after ostensibly letting them go. Then it becomes clear that the line is going to come through David, and so the attacks on David intensify. And though David's later life is a train wreck, his family is just a mess. Talk about dysfunctional. Which person is going to have the line of Messiah, and we're just going to attack all of them. And there are instances in the times of the kings where all of the brothers are assassinated except for one who's hidden away. That keeps the line going. So 2 Kings 11, 2 Chronicles 21 and 22 has those stories. Satan even, I would say, tricks God, and I use tricks in quotes, because God pronounces a blood curse on the royal line. So it gets so bad that in Jeremiah 22 verse 30, "Thus says the Lord, write this man," and this is King Jeconiah, "write this man down as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah." So the Messiah has to come from the royal line, and yet God just pronounced a curse on that line, right? So what happened here? We imagine Satan celebrating, saying he finally tricked. But he didn't read the fine print, because the virgin birth actually avoids this curse. And so just like we talked about a hint of the virgin birth in Genesis 3:15, we have, here, the way around this curse is because legally Joseph's firstborn comes from that line, comes through Jeconiah, but Joseph, Jesus' father, is not his blood father. He's really his adopted father, if we can call him that. Jesus bears no blood relationship to Jeconiah, so the blood curses, doesn't affect Jesus at all because he's not in the bloodline. The bloodline comes through Mary, and Mary is a descendant of David, but through a different lineage. So we have Jesus being of the house of David, legally adopted through his father Joseph, through Solomon and that line, and then Mary comes from another line with no curse on it. So interesting. Again, Satan didn't read the fine print. Then later. There's other times, certainly, Haman tries to wipe out the Jews in exile. And so we have this beast ready to devour the child the moment he is born. And so we have to recall the circumstances of Jesus' conception, right? And out of wedlock conception was a capital offense. So Mary could have received the death penalty under the laws of that day. A Roman decree caused a pregnant woman to make a strenuous journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. This would have taken several days, been very strenuous. Herod, upon learning of the birth of Jesus from the Magi, orders the slaughter of the babies because he was worried about a rival to his throne. And then they have to flee to Egypt and then travel back to Nazareth, but they have to go by a different way because Archelaus is every bit as nasty as his father Herod was. So we have all of these attacks, and of course, when Jesus enters his public ministry, he's tempted by the Satan in the wilderness, and we have these demons and all that. So all of these lines attacking Jesus, and again, Satan thinks he's going to be victorious in the crucifixion, but Jesus overcomes that by rising from the grave, and that's kind of the greatest achievement in Jesus' life is the resurrection, and the most important for our lives too. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, for which she is to be nourished for 1260 days. So the rod of iron speaks of messianic destiny. So we have Psalm 2, you shall break them, speaking of the Messiah, with a rod of iron and dash them like pieces, like a potter's vessel. Revelation 2, we looked at earlier, he will rule them with the rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces. This interesting term, caught up, in Greek it's harpazo. The Latin word for that is rapturo, and that's where we get the word rapture. So we have the child, the body of Messiah was raptured. So I'll let you take that where you want it to, wherever you want. We have this implied verse then, implied gap between verse 5 and verse 6. So the child was caught up to the throne, which we know happened, around 2,000 years ago, and then the woman fled into wilderness. Is that kind of symbolic of the diaspora and the Jewish nation spread throughout the earth? Is it going to be a specific time of fleeing that will occur some yet future? Could it be all of those things? We just aren't sure. We're given this time period again, 1260 days, 3.5 years. Many see that as the first half of the tribulation, where Israel, the woman, is protected and really driven into the wilderness. It says fled, but just as the early nation of Israel was, driven into the wilderness there was a place of safety. It was also a place of testing and discipline and waiting on God's promises. And so we see this picture of the nation happening here as well. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. So another scene shift here. We're now back in heaven briefly, where the dragon, basically it's describing how the dragon ended up on earth. And so, again, we have this scene shift and this reference to Michael. You can see some of the passages on your screen there. Michael is always, he's more of a military type role, and he's always seen as the protector of Israel. And so we have this kind of theme running through here. War in heaven, that's a bit of a startling verse, because our notion is that heaven is just purely peaceful. We rest on clouds and we play harps, right? I'm kidding there. But this war really symbolizes the spiritual warfare that we're in every day, right? There's a cosmic battle between good and evil. We have the red dragon, Satan, and then Michael on God's side. And so it's really Michael and Satan that are counterparts. Oftentimes we view Jesus and Satan as counterparts. Jesus was not created. Satan is very powerful, yet he's still created. Jesus is the creator. So it's more fitting to say that Michael and Satan are equals, but fortunately for us, Michael is just a little bit better. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So we can see that if we treat this strictly chronologically, we have Satan being cast out of heaven, a few times. And I talked about that earlier. There's kind of a way around that, is that inverted parallel structure that would, just has a retelling of different things. We see something similar to this in the creation story. So we have the 7 days of creation, and then we go back and we pick up the story of Adam and Eve. So, skeptics would see that and say, well, you got two conflicted creation stories here, but really that's just the style of that day, was to go back, circle back to something that was said earlier and provide us different or additional detail about it. What is interesting here is that at some point, we know Satan had authority by God. Job talks about Satan being in heaven, that he had access to heaven. And so basically he appeared to be, kind of a role of a prosecuting attorney. But at some point he gets a little full of himself, and he he gets cast out and he goes beyond his job description, and God has to deal with him there. There's what Chuck Missler calls required reading if you want to know about Satan. It's Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, and those are easy to remember because they're both multiples of 7. And so read those 2 chapters in one sitting, and it's a good history, because it starts out talking about a national kingdom, and then it goes beyond that, and we're talking about the spiritual force behind the kingdom, which is Satan. Kind of on that same note, there are pairs of chapters that talk about Babylon, Isaiah 13 and 14. And then Isaiah 14 goes into Satan as well. Jeremiah 50 and 51, and then Revelation 17 and 18. And so we'll get into that as we get into the Babylon chapters in Revelation 17. But if you have time, it's worth reading these chapters and getting a good background of them. 1 Peter says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour." So Satan means accuser in Hebrew, and so many, it's fair to say that is actually a title. It's not his proper name, although it becomes that. Michael Heiser, the author of The Unseen Realm, he prefers to call him the Satan. And this is to remind us that this is not a guy in red tights holding a pitchfork. This is the chief of the accusers and the chief of deceivers, because that's his job. Somehow, some way, he was appointed by God to do this job before he got full of himself. There's a very interesting passage here in 2 Chronicles where God is kind of upset with a king of Israel, and he has this council, the divine council scene, and finally someone suggests, well, would you like me to go send a deceiving spirit to the prophets to entice the king to do the wrong thing? And God says, yes, that's what I want. So it's kind of puzzling there, but again, that's 2 Chronicles 18, 17 through 22. And so this is kind of Satan's role. So Satan here is is part of, I guess, God's team on, accusing the brothers and really proving, tempting, testing. But then at some point after this, Satan goes beyond what he is supposed to do, and then he's cast out. So again, at some point, whether this has already happened or whether it will happen some point in the future, Satan is permanently banished from God's presence. So an earlier verse in Luke, Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning." Jesus could have been using what's called the prophetic past tense, meaning he sees it as if it's already completed, even though on our timeline, it may not have happened yet. I don't really think it's helpful to argue whether this has happened or not happened yet. It's just interesting to get a different perspective. Basically, as it affects us, Satan is real, and he is a present threat to us, and we have to have our armor of God on. And so in our chiasm, this would be like the interlude, the middle section. And I heard a loud voice in heaven, so we're back in heaven, saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God, and they have conquered, overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They loved not their lives even unto death." So the accuser can no longer accuse us before God, and that's great news, and there's cause for celebration. So the good news is we have been given supernatural power to overcome the enemy. And one way we do that is not loving our lives. So see, these people here, the martyrs, they loved not their lives, even if it meant laying down their life and dying and being a martyr for him. So that is how we overcome. And so a question for us is, are we willing to lay down our life instead of compromise our witness? And that's just something for us to tackle. "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them." And so then the next section really shifts to earth. "But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child." So really we have heaven and earth are out of harmony with each other, right? Heaven's rejoicing because Satan's gone from them, but woe to the earth because Satan is now taking up residence on the earth. So technically we don't have a third woe statement like we did with the first two, but scholars see this mention of the word woe as the third woe is implied here. So that third, the seventh and final trumpet is the third woe. An important point, which we know from experience, is Satan, he attacks Israel and the Jewish people even after the resurrection. And so this didn't end with the resurrection. You think one part says, well, God's already won, so why does he keep doing this? And yet these attacks continue until evil is defeated. So we have to ask, why is Satan so interested in non-believing Jews? And then why is he interested in us, right? We've already got the victory. But we have to remember, think of a criminal or even an animal that is out of options, and they've got nothing to lose. Or, like I said, a criminal who's got nothing to lose. You expect good behavior from that scenario, and probably no. When someone's got nothing to lose, they're just going to let it loose. And so I think we need to flip that around, because you and I also have nothing to lose. If we're in Christ, if the evil sin with reckless abandon, how much more should we live our lives righteously for Jesus and to be an ambassador of him? We've got nothing to lose too, so I think we can forget that. It just seems like we're just under attack all the time, but we've got someone more powerful than the enemy who is behind us. But the woman given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly or flee from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for time, times, and half a time. And so again, parallel passages. We saw this earlier. She was in the wilderness for 1280 days, and now it's time, half the time. So eagle's wings, we have a reference in Exodus 19. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Isaiah 40, those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. The serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. And so this is sort of like the mockery, the mimicking of the flood of Genesis. I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So God, the human race had become demonically corrupt. The DNA in the gene pool got messed up, and so that was a reason for the flood. And Noah was preserved through it. So Satan here tries a reversal. So it's not the corrupted, but it's the pure, the followers of Jesus, the followers, the offspring of the woman, the followers of Jesus, who now have to be wiped away. And so the water could be literal water, or it could be really symbolic of any destructive force, persecution, that kind of thing. We often say our troubles come on us like a flood. It just feels like it's relentless. But that's just kind of what it feels like. So when Satan opens his mouth, the good news is that the earth opens its mouth, and we'll see that next. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. And so this is kind of a cryptic passage. We have to remember that the earth dwellers are the antagonists, and yet here the earth itself comes to the aid of the woman. So essentially, God wins. He's going to come to the aid of his people. And a little bit long, but let's read Psalm 124. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when people rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive. When their anger was kindled against us, then the flood would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us, then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. Verse 17, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So if the Jews are the woman's primary offspring who fled into the wilderness, then I think a reasonable conclusion here is that, he's sort of turning his attention towards someone else. And so who is a good candidate? Well, that would be the Gentiles, the believing Gentiles, those who are grafted into the woman Israel through faith in Messiah. Those would be the rest of her offspring. So many Christians, we have to look at this verse, those who keep the commandments of God. So many Christians today believe that we aren't subject to any commandments. But I think this verse and numerous others in the New Testament would actually be against that. If you hold to the testimony of Jesus, you have to keep his commandments. Anything else would be a contradiction, right? You can't say you obey someone and then not do what that someone says. That's kind of the definition of disobedience, not obedience. So we don't have to keep all 613 commandments that are listed in the Old Testament, but we are to keep those that Jesus or the apostolic authors conferred on us. So Acts 15 lists 4 of those that we have to keep. We talked about those previously in our study here. Any others we may wish to voluntarily take on just as a form of discipline and as a way to draw closer to our God. So not compulsory, but voluntarily. In fact, even the Old Testament laws, no one person had to keep all 613 laws, right? Some were applicable to Levites. Some apply only if there's a temple standing. Some apply only to women. And many are viewed as not applicable if one doesn't live in the nation Israel. So we have to keep this in mind that, the law is situational in some respects, based on, kind of your status and where you are. So, it's kind of individual in that sense. I don't want to make it seem like we're making up our own laws, because we don't. But, Romans, we have a couple examples here. We have to keep as many laws as we're called to keep, in other words, right? The number is not 0. It's something more than 0. But it's not the whole. You don't have to keep the whole law the way that Jews living in the land of Israel would. So Romans 13:10, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. Galatians 6, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So it's worth it to go check out all of these passages. And remember, keeping commandments for us is not a got to, but it's a get to, right? It's a way we can honor Jesus. It's a way we can acknowledge his lordship over our life, and it's a way we can demonstrate to others that we're his ambassador. Our behavior reflects on him, and so we want to make sure we're representing him fairly. And so again, remember that there's a group of people who think they're believers, but Jesus will say, I never knew you. And so here we kind of take all these verses together, make war on those who keep the commandments of God. We actually want to be in that category, so we need to make sure we're in that category. Then we have this last verse. It may be verse 17 in your Bible. It may be verse 18 in your Bible. It talks about, and he stood on the sand of the sea. And it's really just odd, and it's misplaced. The ESV has this as a tag on verse 17. NLT has this as a verse 18, a whole new verse. And then the King James has this as verse 1 of chapter 13, and it has John saying it. And I, John, stood upon the sand of the sea. So in any case, it really belongs with chapter 13. So we'll pick it up next time. And then chapter 13 is where we'll discuss the infamous mark of the beast and those who can't buy or sell, and maybe some possible parallels to our society today. So we will look at that next time.